Okay, now we're in the final unit, Unit 5, and in this lecture, we're going to characterize free will. We looked at free will and determinism at a very high level in the last video lecture. This lecture, we're going to get a little bit more fine-grained, specifically with respect to free will. We're not going to look at determinism during this lecture. Here's a thought experiment. One day you're sitting in a classroom listening to your instructor lecture. And if you're a good student, or you're playing on your smartphone because you're naughty, when the instructor suddenly asks a question, suddenly your hand shoots up. You knock your neighbor's book onto the floor and the instructor says your name, expecting an answer from you while the rest of the class giggles. How embarrassing. And here's the thing. You did not intend to raise your arm. Worse, despite your best efforts, you cannot lower your arm. Worser still, you feel your mouth begin to move, and a voice comes from your vocal cords, giving an answer you never considered. It's like you're a puppet. You're being controlled by others against your will. You give a terrible answer. The instructor, me, Davis, and the class laugh hysterically at you, not with you. Well, reflect for a moment. You realize that you can't take the blame for such a terrible answer. Forgiving the answer was not under your control. Nor are you blameworthy for scattering the books on the floor. For once again, scattering the books on the floor was not under your control. This is a weird situation. In normal classroom situations, when you raise your hand and ask a question or give an answer, it is up to you and it is voluntary. You decide to do it. Now, I say, most philosophers would say that in the first situation you did not act of your own free will, but I'm sure there's some smart-ass freshmen that will disagree. But we'll go with what most philosophers would say. So this leads then to two questions that we're going to address in this video lecture. One, what is it to have free will? And two, do we have free will? Well, let's address the first question. What is free will? Well, according to philosophical and psychological tradition, the will is a faculty of the mind that produces voluntary behavior. So, for example, the explanation for why Jones gave up smoking references the will. The explanation for why Jones flinched when someone punched him, on the other hand, would not reference the will. You know, that'd be like your autonomic nervous system, okay? You don't decide to flinch, but you can decide to try to quit smoking. These days, most philosophers and psychologists have kind of given up on this notion of a will. They don't think it's this like faculty in the mind. But we can still inquire into the meaning of he did action A of his own free will, or he freely performed action A. So we can ask the question, what is it for an action to be free? And that's a meaningful question, and that's certainly something we can still address these days, even if we don't believe in this will. But we'll call it the will anyways, though. So let's return to the example of raising the arm. The example first suggests that to have freely raised your arm, it must have been up to you. So when you raised your arm uncontrollably, it was not up to you. When your mouth starts moving and words come out, in this example, it wasn't up to you. But in most normal situations when you raise your hand, it is up to you. Further, the fact that it must have been up to you if you freely raised your arm also implies that if you had freely raised your arm, you didn't have to. You could have not raised your arm. You could have decided not to. So a free actions being up to the agent of the action implies that the agent could have done otherwise. There were alternative courses of action. So you didn't have to raise your hand. That was one alternative, was to raise your hand, and another alternative was to keep your hand down. Well, on contrast, if you have to do an action, then you cannot do otherwise than that action. All right. So in the thought experiment, you had to raise your hand. You couldn't have done otherwise because something was controlling you. But in normal situations, something's not controlling you. So we would say in most situations, you do not have to raise your arm. Well, this suggests then two aspects to free actions. And these are important. Pay attention. They might be on a quiz. One, the action is up to the agent. And 2, the action could have done, 2, the agent could have done otherwise than the action. So the action, a free action would be up to the agent, and the agent could have done otherwise. Those are the 2 aspects to free action. Well, let's examine this second aspect then, the could have done otherwise aspect a little bit more. This is important. So we fail to capture the notion of free will if we say that an agent can perform one or the other course of action. What do I mean by that? So, well, let's explore it. Well, suppose you're in a room tied to a chair. Then the following statement is true. You can either stand up or you can remain seated. Okay? That is not what we mean by can do otherwise. That's what logicians call a disjunction. And when there's a disjunction, where there's an either or statement, A or B, only one of the two, A or B, has to be true. So if you can stand up, it can still be false that you can remain seated. But the disjunction, you can stand up or remain seated, can be true, even if it's false that you can remain seated or it's false that you can stand up. Now, we covered disjunctions briefly in the first few weeks when we looked at argumentation and we looked at valid deductive arguments, but you may not remember. So here's another example. It's either raining outside or it's sunny outside. That could be a true disjunction. It doesn't mean then that it's true that it is raining outside and it's true that it's sunny outside. It just means that it's true that it's raining outside or it's sunny outside. All right, so that we don't mean then that you can do one or the other, that you can either stand up or you can remain seated. All right, so the following statement is false. You can stand up and you can stay seated. Well, I've probably already explained this, but let's think about it. Why is that statement false, while this statement is true? Well, the first aspect, well, I'll just explain right now. Because you can't stand up and stay seated at the same time. All right, so we need to have a better understanding then of can do otherwise. Well, let's talk about what we mean by the word can. It implies power or ability. Okay? Having the power to do A or the power to do B. So there's at least 3 definitions of the word can, and only one is what we're going to have in mind when we're talking about free will. First, sometimes we say a certain event can happen or could have happened when all we mean is for all we know it could have happened. So suppose I don't know anything about history. Then, for all I knew, George Washington could have used lasers to kill whales. But that's just doesn't mean that George Washington actually could have been doing that. It just means based on my beliefs and knowledge, it was possible. So in these cases, all we are saying is that it is consistent with what we know that George Washington shot lasers. Second, sometimes can implies a legal definition. So for example, Bill can smoke marijuana in Colorado. James cannot smoke marijuana in Iowa because it's legal in Colorado and illegal in Iowa. But this sense of can does not mean that Bill is physically able or unable to smoke marijuana while James is not. It just means that he's not legally able. Additionally, a related term free has a legal definition that is not relevant to free will discussions. James is not legally free to smoke marijuana, but that doesn't mean he couldn't freely smoke marijuana. That is, smoking marijuana would be up to him and he could do otherwise. Well, instead, then, when we're speaking of someone's freely performing an action, we'll mean that they do perform the action and they could have done otherwise than perform the action. This then attributes to them some power or ability to do otherwise. It's a causal power they have. Well, this leads to a second question. Do we have free will? Well, I want to venture to say that most people believe they have free will. There are always going to be exceptions. Philosophers, for example, are probably an exception, perhaps many other scientists. Or people that have just, taken philosophy courses. Or someone who's watched one too many YouTube videos by high school kids in their parents' basements who've read some Nietzsche. Like Asriel, the Prince of Sorrow. But prior to examining sophisticated philosophical arguments or persuasive to high school kids YouTube arguments, assuming that we generally act of our own free wills, I'm going to venture to say it's going to be natural for many of us. Now, this is a cultural claim, so I'm going to say it's probably natural for a lot of people in Indiana to believe that. Though perhaps are other cultures that have different assumptions. But we'll start locally, okay? So here's the question then. Is that a reasonable belief? That is, are there any good reasons to think we have free will? Well, some philosophers have suggested that there are propositions which, if thought about carefully and thoroughly, can simply be seen to be true or false. Here's an example. The incarnadine philosopher is a philosopher. Alright, take that statement right here. Bleh, bleh. The incarnadine philosopher is a philosopher. How can you know that is true? Well, you don't actually need to do any observational research. You don't need a laboratory. You don't need to look around to smell anything to know that the statement, the incarnadine philosopher is a philosopher, is true. You don't even need to know what the word incarnadine means. And I don't remember what it means, and I'm your philosophy instructor. But I still know this statement is true. All you have to do is understand the structure of the sentence, and then you can see that the structure of the sentence ensures the truth of the statement. All right? So that's what we call a de dicto necessary statement, which is Latin. De dicto is Latin for about the word. It's true by the meaning of the words alone. It's also what we call a logical truth. Here's other examples. The shortest spy in the world is a spy. You can just, once you understand the meanings of most of the words in that sentence, you can know it's true. The tallest tree is a tree. The green goat is green. Davis is Davis. A equals A. These are all de dicto necessary statements, okay? Other claims, though, are not logical truths, but they probably have this feature of being kind of transparently true to us, though. So here's an example. Prior to television, Facebook, and video games, etc., the statement, "You are thinking right now," when said to a group of undergraduates, would have had this feature. It would have just been transparently true. And it's still true for most of you undergrads. I'm joking. I shouldn't make jokes about kids these days and their YouTubes and their Twitters. But there are other examples. So knowing that you're in pain or having a headache and so on. It's just obvious. That's not a de dicto true statement, but it's still obviously true to you. You don't infer it from anything. Well, these cases are true because they seem true to you, and that's all you need. All you have to go on are your seemings. These seemings provide indubitable, that is undoubtable, indisputable evidence. For example, your seeming that you have a headache is all the evidence you need to know that you have a headache. Well, here's a question then. Is our belief that we have free will appropriately similar to the cases of logical truths or certain truths from seemings? Well, knowing that one is free isn't like these logical truths like the shortest spy is a spy. But there is one item that most of us can offer if asked why we have free will, and it's simply that we seem to be free. Let's elaborate on this. What is it to seem to be free? When we're apparently confronted with two mutually incompatible courses of action, for example, you can't stand and sit at the same time, but you have the power to stand and you also have the power to sit, just not at the same time. It undeniably seems to us that there are genuine alternatives for us, that we can choose to engage in either course of action equally well. It just seems up to us whether we, one, continue listening to Davis' lecture, for example, or two, space out. So, someone could argue that by merely attending to what this and other circumstances are like, we can tell by introspection that we have power over our future behavior. No one is in a position to inform us that it doesn't seem that way to us. No more than someone can inform us that we don't feel like we're in pain or that we're not really thinking now. Granted, seeming like things are up to us counts as evidence that we are free, just as feeling as if we have pulled a muscle while engaging in vigorous exercise counts as evidence that we in fact have pulled a muscle. This is weak evidence, at least in the case of free will. So there's a disanalogy then between feeling that we are in pain and feeling like we are free. One cannot feel like they are in pain and fail to be in pain. For feeling that way just is what being in pain amounts to. But feeling like one is free is not what being free amounts to. Further, feelings can mislead us. We may feel like we've pulled a muscle when we haven't. Thus, the introspective evidence we have for the belief that we have the power to follow out alternative courses of action is not strong evidence. Now, that doesn't mean it's not evidence, it's just not strong evidence. But there is something important in introspective territory that bolsters the claim that other common beliefs we have, if true, make it reasonable to think we have free will. What are those? Well, acting of our own free will is often thought to follow some process of deliberation. One deliberates when one tries to decide what to do, when one considers the choice of pursuing one of the other alternative course of action. It involves weighing options and anticipating their consequences for the purposes of making a decision. And, most importantly, all properly functioning humans deliberate. Notice, just because all properly functioning humans deliberate, that doesn't mean that all properly functioning humans make the right choice. So what deliberation teaches us? Well, question, what can deliberation then teach us about free will, given that deliberation is an undeniable and unavoidable type of human behavior? That's right, it's unavoidable. We all do it all the time. We don't always deliberate about whether or not we're going to be deliberating, okay? Well, when we deliberate, we operate on the assumption that the future, unlike the past, is open in some sense. That we have the power to influence, to a greater or lesser degree, what happens in the future. So I don't deliberate about the past. I can't decide to have not eaten Lucky Charms for breakfast 2 days ago, or 2 hours ago, okay? But I can deliberate about what I'm going to eat for lunch today, if it's not lunchtime yet, because that's this kind of asymmetry between the past and the future. The past is fixed. The future is open. So we have the power to influence the future, whereas we don't have the power to influence the past anymore, right? That's this asymmetry, and we assume this asymmetry between the past and the future when we deliberate. So further, when we deliberate, we operate on the assumption that more than one course of action is open to us. For example, if I deliberate about whether to eat Lucky Charms or Frosted Flakes, I operate on the assumption that I could do both. I don't deliberate, though, about what to do if I don't believe that my future actions are under my control. So I'm not going to deliberate about eating Lucky Charms on Jupiter tomorrow. That's not an option available to me, right? So then when we deliberate, we betray this belief that the future is open. That is, we manifest a belief that our actions are not the consequences of something outside of our own control, all right? If for example, when you're in prison and you only get a cheese sandwich for lunch every day, you don't deliberate about what to eat for lunch because there's not any options. There's just the cheese sandwich, all right? Thus, if we should judge the reasonableness of believing some view by considering how well it fits with other things we take ourselves to be justified in believing or find self-evident and seem unable to give up, then it's reasonable to believe that we have free will. Well, we deliberate. So in that sense, deliberation then is pretty good evidence for free will. Pretty good reason to me. I mean, having free will makes sense of this thing that we all do all the time, deliberation. In fact, it probably wouldn't make sense deliberation wouldn't make sense if we didn't have free will, okay? So that's a pretty powerful argument. Well, there's another reason. It has to do with moral responsibility. Another common belief about the nature of human agents, bearing importantly on our belief that we are free, is the belief that humans are morally responsible agents. We're subject to praise or blame for some of our actions. For example, if you rob a bank, you should be blamed. If you save a drowning baby, you should be praised, okay? But we can't legitimately offer praise or blame unless we are really responsible for these actions, unless we could have done otherwise than what we did. So, if one could not fail to rob a bank due to hypnosis, then that person shouldn't be blamed. In fact, if you're in court and you're a defendant on trial for robbing a bank, but then they had really powerful proof that someone else had hypnotized you, you'd probably be free, and then the person who hypnotized you would be blamed. So if the person who saved the baby was under the control of Martians, for example, then that person wouldn't be praised, or shouldn't be praised. It'd be like praising a remote control car. So, in order to genuinely deliberate about future actions and to be morally responsible, we have to have free will. We do seem to deliberate often about what we regard as alternative courses of actions, and we also seem to be appropriately subject to praise and blame. That is, we seem to be morally responsible agents. So, it just seems to be the case that we do indeed have free will. Important note though, we haven't settled the question as yet of whether or not we have free will. Instead, we move the question back. There is a question that remains. Is the fact that we deliberate and that we treat ourselves and others as morally responsible agents sufficient for our having free will? And the answer to this question is not easily found. We can agree, though, that it is at least powerful evidence in favor of the free will thesis. All things considered, that tips the balance, or it tips the scales in favor of us having free will.